109 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Before we begin, I need to ask all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Please take note of the following preventative measures. Only use a black approved earpiece. Keep your earpiece away from the microphone at all times, and when not using the earpiece, please place it down on the sticker placed on the table. Thank you for your consideration. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, October 17th, 2023, the committee is resuming its study of the 2026 CIIT review. We have with us today, hopefully from the Brookings Institution, Joshua Meltzer, Canadian Labour Congress, Sivan Bipon, Executive Vice President, and Elizabeth Kwan, Senior Researcher, Canadian Trucking Alliance, Stephen Laskowski, President, and Lakshon, Director, Policy and Industrial Awareness by video conference, and from GT and Company Executive Advisor, Steve Verrill, Principal. Welcome in a different capacity, Steve, to have you here. And from the Quebec Network for Inclusive Globalization, Claude Valencourt, member and spokesperson, again by video conference. Well, we're trying to get Mr. Meltzer connected. We will start with the Canadian Labour Congress. Ms. Vibon, please. The floor is yours for up to 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the Standing Committee. I am Siobhan Vipond, and I'm the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. The CLC is Canada's largest labour body and speaks on issues of national importance for 3 million unionised workers in every sector across the country. We welcome the opportunity to provide input on the 2026 CUSMA review. The impact of CUSMA on Canadian workers cannot be overstated, and the importance of the 2026 CUSMA review cannot be overstated either. The review is one of the key priorities for Canada's unions. CUSMA came into force July 1st, 2020, and no one could have anticipated the number and magnitude of global and domestic disruptions since 2020 affecting trade. The review will take place in potentially different political configurations given all three countries have federal elections before 2026. Canada's enduring goal for the review must be strategic rather than perfunctory. Canada must align with the US's worker-centered trade approach that is beneficial for workers, powered by workers, and directly engages unions from the start. A worker-centered approach will deliver good-paying jobs by increasing the growth of unions and helping strengthening obligations and implementation of CUSMA in labour, environment, and inclusive trade chapters. For instance, strong climate change commitments and obligations must be added to the environment chapter at the review, given the significant impact on jobs. Chair, our recommendations for the review engagement are as follows. As part of a worker-centered trade approach, the government must actively engage with the CLC, on par with the current level of engagement in the US but between government and the AFL-CIO. The government should establish a tripartite CUSMA review task force of government, unions, and businesses to identify, review, and make recommendations on priority issues for Canada. And the government must conduct meaningful consultations with unions and other civil society stakeholders. In the review, the government should elevate the worker-centered approach through the robust implementation of obligations in the labour chapter that includes improving and expanding the application of the rapid response mechanism, advancing full compliance to prohibit the importation of goods produced by forced labour, addressing violence against workers exercising their labour rights, enforcing obligations regarding discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and ensuring more labour rights and protections for migrant workers. We wish to underscore that Canada is out of step with the US in 3 key areas: a worker-centered trade approach, the utilization of the RRM, and the prohibition on the importation of goods produced by forced labour. The CLC urges the government to close these gaps in the review in order to deliver more benefits for Canadian workers and communities. The agenda for the review is shaping up, and the US and Canada and Mexico, the US and Mexico signaling the issues they intend to bring to the table. Mexico wants the rapid response mechanism to apply to the US and Canada, which is not the case now. The U.S. plans to raise their concern with Canada's digital service tax and the long-standing tensions with supply management of dairy. The U.S. may also table perennial trade irritants of softwood lumber and automotive rules of origin. The threat of China's very aggressive moves to gain EV market share globally and in North America is anticipated to be prominently featured in the renewal discussions. In May, the U.S. imposed massive tariff increases on Chinese goods, including 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, and substantial increases for lithium-ion EV batteries and semiconductors. Canada is contemplating whether it will follow suit. There are also fears that Chinese investments in Mexico EV manufacturing may be coming, and CUSMA may be used to enable exports to the U.S. and Canada, circumventing any direct tariff measures in place. The CLC agrees that the need to protect EV jobs and manufacturing against Chinese exports to North America and look to the CUSMA review to shore up protections. Canada's unions have two opportunities to propose worker-centered propositions to improve labor rights and obligations in CUSMA. The first is the upcoming 5-year review of the implementation and operation of the CUSMA labor chapter in 2025, and the second is the 2026 CUSMA review, where labor can advocate for workers in the other chapters. The CLC will be there fighting for Canadian workers every step of the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Laskowski, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee members. I'm also joined today on the screen by our Director of Policy responsible for the files I'm talking about, Lac Shown. First off, I'd like to thank the committee for bringing to our attention and to business sectors and labor attention that you are preparing for the CUSMA reviews, and well in advance of them, and congratulate you, and we look forward to the opportunity. Very briefly, the Canadian Trucking Alliance is in fact an alliance of the 7 provincial trucking associations across Canada. Together we have 5,000 members representing about 250,000 employees. With regards to NAFTA and CUSMA, they've benefited all 3 countries, and by extension, all 3 of the trucking sectors. The trucking sector in Canada and the United States moves Canada-U.S. trade primarily. With regards to CUSMA itself, our main message is let's not forget about the trucks that move the trade. A lot of focus, as it needs to be, is on the trade between goods between our countries and how they can flourish. But they can't flourish if they can't get to market. The one thing the pandemic showed everyone across society what a supply chain is and who moves it. When the trucks have a problem, the supply chain has a problem. So what we want to do in the 2026 review is ensure that CUSMA looks at every opportunity that there is to improve the efficiency of the Canadian trucking industry, moving U.S. exports into Canada and obviously our imports into the United States. There are 2 main issues that we will be working with the Government of Canada and are working with the Government of Canada, which may be an opportunity under the CUSMA review. One is the repositioning of foreign empty trailers. Currently, it is illegal for a trucking company in Canada, a Canadian trucking company, to reposition an empty trailer in the United States, vice versa. It is not illegal if you wait for that trailer to be unloaded, then move the same one. So, folks, basically, we've got a trailer debate. The modern economy doesn't move like that in the supply chain. The most efficient way to move goods in the supply chain is to move a trailer in that's full, drop it, and move an empty one. And that's all we're asking on both sides of the border. The Canadian government, Minister Alghabra, has already indicated, a previous Minister of Transport, indicated to the United States that, in very different language, but I'll be more direct, we're ready when you are. So what we'd like to do under CUSMA is to see how we can move the Americans towards this system. It's great for their exports, it's great for our imports, etc. The other issue that we would like to see addressed during the CUSMA review, if not before, is in transit movements. Basically, this allows trucks in Canada to move domestically through the United States. Currently, we allow the Americans to do the same thing. So if goods want to move between Michigan and New York State, they can move through Ontario. We allow it. The Americans do not allow us to move goods between Ontario and Vancouver. Pick an example, doesn't really matter. I use that example as the floods happened. We were able to get a temporary relief. 4,500 loads moved that way. There is a demand for it. If not before CUSMA, we are hoping CUSMA addresses that. There are other items that we will be working with the Government of Canada on, and I'll just be very quickly. Under the U.S.-Canada Tax Treaty, there are examples. U.S. legal system threats to trade, and what we mean by that one specifically really quickly. There are many nuclear verdicts. A nuclear verdict is defined by anything over $10 million. That is causing great concern for Canadian trucking companies to move goods into the United States. The question the Canadian industry has, can CUSMA, there are some domestic moves in the United States limiting these nuclear verdicts on trucking. Can CUSMA deal with nuclear verdicts through the NAFTA CUSMA agreement? International cargo and fraud theft, can that be dealt with under CUSMA? Border inspections, joint border inspections, efficiencies at the border, again, can that be dealt with under CUSMA? And obviously, the one question we have and do not have answers, the other ones we have some answers, or so we think we do, but the emerging market of Mexico, currently, most of that trade will move by rail. But will there come a time where there will be North American movement of trucks from Mexico all the way into Canada? And if so, what needs to be done to examine that? We are asking the question and during the CUSMA review to see what those opportunities are. That's my initial comments, Madam Chair. Look forward to taking questions. But again, I just want to thank the committee for this opportunity and how important it is that we are prepared in our sector and others for this opportunity, because there is no more bigger economic importance than trade between the United States and Canada. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Let's give Mr. Meltzer a try now and see if he's connected properly.
Great. Am I coming through clearly?
I think so.
Great. So it's my pleasure.
5 minutes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. It's my pleasure to be here today, obviously, before the House of Commons Standing Committee to testify on CUSMA and the joint review in 2026. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I lead the USMCA initiative. This initiative was established shortly after the overwhelming bipartisan support for the agreement in Congress, where we saw an opportunity in this vote and its support by key US labour unions to reset the conversation around North American economic integration. We've done this by providing a tracker of all the trade, investment and jobs from North America trade across all states and provinces and countries. For instance, we've found that CUSMA supports approximately 17 million jobs across North America. We also track the parties' compliance with their CUSMA obligations and have established a scorecard which allows us to compare compliance by each government and assess from how far compliance is from each government. And it's actually my pleasure to report to you that the Canadian government is the least non-compliant party to CUSMA. We also produce reports and analysis, including our annual USMCA Forward report, which assesses progress each year and looks forward to what more can be done to build a more competitive, inclusive and sustainable economic relationship across North America. We've had the honour of contributions from a number of very senior cabinet ministers, including Minister Eng, Minister Champagne and Minister Wilkinson, in addition to business leaders such as Paul Desmarais Jr., CEO of PowerCore, Goldie Hyder, President of the Canadian Business Council, and other Canadian thought leaders from civil society and academia. This is clearly a pivotal time for the United States and the world when it comes to international trade. The current system of world trade based in the WTO is being challenged by geopolitical competition, heightened risks from dependence on trade with countries such as China, and unfair competition. North American trade and investment ties have always been critical for the prosperity of Canada, the US and Mexico. And CUSMA is the agreement around which this economic cooperation is based. More than a traditional trade agreement, it is a blueprint to realize the potential of an integrated, competitive North American region. And since it was signed 3.5 years ago, it has contributed to boosting trade and investment across the region, creating thousands of jobs and raising labour standards. I know this is not news to you, but worth stating for the record is that CUSMA is the most important trade agreement for all three countries. 78% of Canada's exports go to its North American partners, and over 85% of Mexico's exports go to its North American partners, and around 30% of US exports go to Mexico and Canada, which is over 4 times US exports to China. And a lot of this is in intermediate goods crossing back and forth to make complex goods like cars, medical equipment, IT products, pharmaceutical, and more. In 2023, trade in North America was about $1.85 trillion, or about $3 million a minute. There's been a 47% increase in North American trade since 2020 when CUSMA came into effect. And since 2020, an estimated additional 4 million jobs have been created across North America on top of the total of 17 million jobs noted before. So the economic importance of CUSMA is clear. I want to turn briefly now to the geopolitical importance of CUSMA. On the one hand, the last few years have shown us some of the risks, but also the resiliency of supply chains across North America. COVID-19 showed the risks of relying on China for medical equipment compared with the strong performance of North American supply chains in delivering on medical equipment and more. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has impacted trade in agricultural commodities and demonstrated the global trade impacts of even localized conflict. And trade relations are being fundamentally rethought in light of geopolitical competition with China. This is due to a number of challenges, including the need to respond to China's economic model that provides enormous subsidies to manufacturing, which leads to an oversupply of products, increasingly in high-tech areas such as EVs. And with low domestic demand, the result of this economic model is increasing reliance by China on exports to North America and Europe in particular to absorb the excess production. And China has also demonstrated that when countries rely on it as a source of supply or as a market for its exports, China will use this leverage to coerce cooperation to achieve other political objectives. The US talks about de-risking trade with China by creating alternative sources of supply, particularly products that are critical for economic and national security. But to de-risk will require even closer North American cooperation, more trade and investment, and a bigger vision for what we can achieve together, whether on climate, digital, labour, worker training, and more. And this is where CUSMA is so important, both economically and as a geostrategic opportunity. Let me now turn to the joint review briefly. I'm not going to go over what the joint review will require, but I just want to make the following. Failure to renew CUSMA in 2026 will increase business uncertainty, risk, and cost of investment, and reduce the trade needed to achieve the economic and geostrategic goals outlined below. Between now and 2026, there'll be elections in the United States and in Canada. The outcomes of the US presidential elections are perhaps the most important in determining whether there will be a successful renewal in 2026. What is clear is that whoever is in the White House, the need for renewal of CUSMA will be used to push for resolution of specific trade issues. The joint review provides an opportunity to develop a forward-looking agenda on what the three countries can do to strengthen North American competitiveness, build more secure and resilient supply chains, make progress on building a more digitally aligned North American market, and to further develop North America as a source of investment stability and strength when it comes to geostrategic competition with China. To achieve this will require addressing outstanding trade irritants, where possible, before the joint review. Bringing outstanding issues arising from past CUSMA disputes into the joint review would risk missing this opportunity to use the joint review to build a forward agenda and increase the risk that we do not achieve renewal of the agreement in 2026. Thank you. I look forward to answering any further questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verul, for 5 minutes, please.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. The CUSMA review on July 1st, 2026 is shaping up to be a potentially critical turning point in Canada's trading relationship with the U.S. How the review turns out could go a long way towards determining if we continue down the path towards a more integrated North American market, or whether the U.S. will go further down the track of going it alone. Canada will face significant challenges with the U.S. on trade no matter what happens in the U.S. election on November 5th. Both Republicans and Democrats, though seemingly more divided than ever, are both more protectionist and more interventionist than previous U.S. administrations. The joint review, which is unique among trade agreements, requires that all three parties commit in writing that they want the agreement to continue. If any of the three do not make this commitment, there will be annual reviews until the agreement expires in 2036 or until all three parties agree to extend it for another 16 years. The review clause is not a good fit in a trade agreement. Trade agreements are intended to last indefinitely, to give confidence to businesses and investors about the rules of the game. Like NAFTA, CUSMA already has a withdrawal clause and a clause that allows provisions to be added, changed, or removed at the agreement of parties. The only reason the review clause is in the agreement is that the U.S. wanted to build in leverage for it to seek changes to the agreement on an ongoing basis. But this undermines confidence in the agreement and introduces ongoing uncertainties. The review is still more than 2 years away, but already business communities in all three countries are concerned about it. That uncertainty around the review clause is compounded by elections that will take place in all three countries before the review, and we know that Mexico just finished their election a couple of days ago. Mexico and Canada will almost certainly support continuation of the agreement given their reliance on the U.S. market. With the world increasingly trending towards regional markets, it is also in the U.S. interest to support a strong North American market. However, both Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. have suggested that the review could be used to renegotiate some elements of the agreement. Both Catherine Tai, the current U.S. Trade Representative, and Robert Lighthizer, the former U.S. Trade Representative, have suggested that the review could be used to address the panel decision the U.S. lost on autos rules of origin. Catherine Tai has also suggested that the issue of dairy could be revisited after the U.S. failed to achieve its objectives in 2 dispute settlement panels. If the U.S. seeks to reverse dispute settlement decisions in the review, it will not only undermine confidence in the dispute settlement process, but in the agreement overall. There are also various other contentious issues that could be part of the review, more with Mexico than with Canada, but a better approach would be to focus on common challenges to the North American market. Now, 3 weeks ago, the U.S. took action against imports from China of electric vehicles, batteries, critical minerals, and some other products. But all three CUSMA parties face challenges from China because of unfair trading practices and security concerns. Rather than all three parties following their own paths on these issues, it would be far better for them to take a more coordinated approach to these challenges. USTR Tai has also talked about addressing challenges posed by new dynamics caused by the pandemic and by climate change in the review. A North American approach to addressing these kinds of issues would have a positive impact and open up new opportunities for growth. The review clause in itself creates unwelcome uncertainty for business, but more significant impacts will depend on whether or not a fractious review can be avoided, what specific issues may be opened or reopened in the review, and whether the parties can instead pursue a more common, forward-looking North American agenda. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very much. And our last witness is Mr. Valancourt, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Je remercie chaleureusement la Commission pour cette
I
invitation.
would like to thank the Commission warmly, the committee warmly for this invitation. I represent the Réseau québécois pour une mobilisation inclusive, RQMI, formerly the Réseau québécois de l'intégration continentale, which is made up of trade union organizations and citizens concerned about the need for fair trade. I'm also a member of Attaque Québec, an association that defends fiscal, social, and environmental justice. As far as ACEUM is concerned, the irritants for us are not so much commercial. They concern human rights, the common good, the environment, democracy, and people's living conditions. Too often in the past, free trade agreements have run counter to these priorities in order to satisfy commercial interests, and we are not the only ones to say so. At ACEUM, we recognize that some progress has been made in relation to NAFTA, and in particular, we welcome the elimination of Investor Trade Dispute Settlement, ISDS, in Chapter 11. Although this is not as complete and rapid as we had hoped, Canada is still being sued by Ruby River Capital, and Mexico is not entirely immune from this type of action. In spite of everything, ACEUM has shown us the right way forward. From now on, Canada should no longer include RDIE in its free trade agreements. ACEUM provides better framework for working conditions, particularly with a view to eliminating forced labor and violence against workers and trade union organizations. On the other hand, several aspects of ACEUM remain problematic. The chapter on environment, for example, is clearly inadequate. Given the current climate emergency and the damage that has been done to biodiversity, the argument needs major updating and should be more binding in terms of achieving environmental protection objectives. In our opinion, it is important that the text of the argument does not hide the realities which we are facing and includes certain keywords such as global warming, climate change, hydrocarbons, methane, and greenhouse gases. The argument should also make direct reference to IPCC recommendations and add two agreements signed by 3 parties to the list of multilateral agreements on the environment in Chapter 7, namely the Paris Climate Agreement and the coming Global Diversity Framework in Montreal. Section 24.9 on the protection of the ozone layer is a good example to follow. We are also concerned about Chapter 28 on good regulatory practice, which makes it more difficult for governments to regulate in favor of the common good. The parties must make a public list of regulations they want to introduce within 1 year, Section 28.6, and justify the regulations with scientific studies, which of course may be contradicted, as unanimity does not always exist in cutting-edge science. During the regulatory impact assessment, the need for the regulation must be justified. Alternative solutions, regulatory or non-regulatory, must be considered, and the benefits and cost of the chosen solution must be explained, Section 28.11. Finally, Section 28, subsection 13, lays down procedures for determining whether the regulations adopted should be amended or repealed. All of these procedures, which are extremely cumbersome and open the door to corporate lobbyists to influence decisions, encourage governments to regulate less, precisely to avoid going through a process that is not very encouraging. That is why we are proposing that Chapter 28 be repealed. Other aspects seem problematic to us. We regret the weakening of supply management, which affects producers' incomes, product quality, and the dynamics of rural life. The agreement tends to favor large-scale agricultural production to the detriment of small and medium-sized family farms, which has a much more harmful impact on the environment of local communities, excrement management, large-scale use of pesticides, contamination of soil, water bodies, and the water table. While this argument seems to us to be an advance on NAFTA in social terms, there are still major irritants that prevent us from seeing it as truly beneficial agreement for the population as a whole. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. On to the members. Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to talk about some of the issues that I see that I kind of call as own goals as we look at the review that's coming in 2026. And so the first one I wanted to talk about, and perhaps Mr. Verhoeven and Mr. Meltzer could comment on this, but the threat to unilaterally implement a digital services tax has raised a lot of unhappiness in the United States. 10 members of Congress wrote a joint letter to Catherine Tai with respect to it. This is from both parties. Michael Plowgan, a top Treasury official, said this is a critical issue. The implementation of a DST by Canada would seriously undermine the Pillar 1 negotiations. I just wonder if either one of you would like to comment on, do you think this is a productive thing for Canada to be doing, going outside of the OECD negotiations, threatening to implement unilaterally a digital services tax and retroactively collect it for the 3 previous years? Is this something that's going to enhance our position when we're negotiating a customer review with the United States? You go ahead and then.
Okay, well, I think certainly the DST issue has the potential to cause some friction if things continue as they are. As members are probably aware, Pillar 1 discussions at the OECD are underway now, and they are seeking to reach an agreement within the coming weeks or months. If they do reach an agreement, then I think that issue gets very much easier, and Canada could be able to land in the right spot. But if those discussions fail at the OECD, then I think Canada does have a dilemma. Do they go ahead and implement it? Because, as you know, it's not implemented yet. Or do they find some other kind of approach? Because in a scenario where the Pillar 1 discussions fail entirely, there's a tough choice.
Sir?
Yeah, I agree with that observation, I think, by Steve. I think where possible, doing this multilaterally through the OECD is clearly the best outcome. I think from a US perspective, there's a couple of concerns with digital DSTs. One is that there's been various DST proposals, not just in Canada, but in other countries. And so part of the concern that the US has with the DST in Canada, I think, is its precedential implications. It sort of green lights and provides cover for other countries going down that pathway. So I think whatever the actual economic impact of that tax is going to be, I think the precedential implications will focus minds in the US as well. This is not. I don't want to get into the weeds, but I think there are genuine questions around. You mentioned the retroactivity elements to it, the fact that it's a tax on revenue rather than profits, which can create various perverse incentives for businesses, are all genuine. I think issues for Canada in terms of the design of the DST, but it's clearly one of those irritants. I think that will come up. I would expect in the lead up to the joint review.
And would both of you describe that as something that the United States would raise as an irritant in the renewal of CUSMA if Canada did unilaterally implement this?
So I think that everything's on the table potentially. I mean, my view is that whoever's in the White House next year will have a list of bilateral trade irritants with Canada that we may try to resolve in some shape or form before the joint review, but risk certainly being carried into the joint review if they're not resolved.
Do you think that, I'm sure you're familiar with Bill 282 that was passed by Parliament. I'm certainly not a supporter of that piece of legislation. I think it's another trade irritant with the United States that could cause trouble in a CUSMA review. If that bill receives royal assent, do you see that as something irritating our American trading partners as we get into this CUSMA review, and something that they would raise in a renegotiation?
Well, I'm not sure that it will be a significant concern for the U.S. in the current context, because both of the panels that they took against Canada had to do with allocation policies for quotas under the tariff rate quotas. Bill C-282 talks about prohibiting increases in tariff rate quotas and reductions in tariffs. Those issues aren't really under discussion between Canada and the U.S. when it comes to the dairy concerns the U.S. has. Their concerns are about the allocation policy. So setting aside what Bill C-282 may imply for other negotiations, I don't see it coming up in the review because that's not the target of the U.S. at this point.
The CLC mentioned forced labor. So Canada has a terrible track record as it exists right now of stopping goods coming into the country with forced labor. The United States has seized billions of dollars of goods. They created an entities list. They update it. They have a reverse onus. If they suspect any goods coming into their country are made with forced labor, the company bringing those goods in have to prove it's not. Canada decided under the current government, the current Liberal government, that the threshold would be set that Canada has to prove they're made with forced labor. So they don't have an entities list, and they've set the threshold very high. I think this is a huge problem. It's taking away Canadian jobs, good union jobs, but I think it's also going to be an irritant with the United States. And if any of the witnesses want to comment on that, if you share my view.
Unfortunately, your time is like a minute over, but you were in such a roll, I really didn't want to interrupt you. So if the witnesses could possibly answer Mr. Seebeck's question while you're going on here at some point or another, so we can get on to the next questioner. Mr. Arya.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm sure all witnesses are aware of a bill currently passing through the Parliament of Canada, Bill 282, that bars Minister of Trade from concluding any free trade agreement that results in opening access to supply managed sector. Basically, it makes supply management non-negotiable. I'll start with you, Mr. Verhul, because of your background in negotiations of many trade agreements Canada has signed with many other countries. What do you think if this is right now it has passed the second reading in Senate? I was hoping that it will die in Senate, but apparently there is still a life in there. So it may even get passed and it may even get royal accent. If that bill becomes a reality, what impact do you think it will have during the review of CUSMA?
Well, I do think, and I mentioned this a little earlier, but I think that for the review of CUSMA, there's not really that much impact in my view, because Bill C-282, as you mentioned, talks about opening access. Every indication I've heard from the U.S. is that they're content with the access that was negotiated in the CUSMA. It's just where that access goes, how the allocation of import quotas is done, and currently it mostly goes to processors. So the U.S. is not going after further tariff reductions or further tariff quota expansion that I've heard. So I'm not sure it's going to be an issue.
So that is the point. When you mentioned dairy in your thing, it was not having a bigger quota or changing the quota.
Right.
Oh, okay. Thanks. And what is your guess how easy it will be when the review process starts?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth leading up to that. And I think even though the review is going to be July 1st of 2026, I think that process will start probably a year or so ahead of that. And there will
Mr.
be
Burrell,
lots of
I hate to
positioning.
interrupt for a moment. Can you just give us a second? The bells are ringing or were ringing. Are they still? Wait, it may be a quorum call. Just give us a second here.
Stop.
They're no longer ringing. I'm sorry. Go back to Mr. Burrell.
Okay, so I think there is lots of positioning going on, and I think that it will really depend on how the U.S. is going to approach it. If the U.S. is going to try to rebalance concessions in its favor and taking away from Mexico and Canada, it will be a very contentious review, obviously. But if we can move to a process where we try to benefit the North American market overall and coordinate more closely between the three parties, then I think there's a real opportunity there.
You know, both Republicans and Democrats, as you mentioned, they're all protectionist. I was born and grew up in a third world country now they call Global South. These were the kind of words we used to hear from our political leaders, that we have to safeguard our industries, we have to save our economy from these imports and put up high tariffs leading to inefficient system, inefficient economic sectors. So with both Trump and Biden administrations, do you think, I'm sure that they will try to extract more concessions, and that obviously will lead to very tough negotiations. And I don't want to envisage it, but is there any possibility that this review will end CUSMA?
I would say, in my view, it's very unlikely, because it is worth a lot to the U.S. as well as to Mexico and to Canada. And I think that would be enough of a big economic shock in the region that we would hope that they wouldn't go that far. I would not be surprised if the U.S. tries to make the deal even better for it than it is now. But I think they will see the need for them to continue with the agreement as well.
Hopefully it will not come to the annual review, but if it comes, things will be very, very difficult. When do you think the uncertainty of review will start actually affecting investments in business?
Well, I think I've certainly been hearing that already the existence of the review clause does create the feeling that it's not as solid as it could be, because you could turn it the direction and go towards an eventual termination of the agreement. So it's already having some impact. I think that as we get closer, if the rhetoric we're hearing, particularly out of the U.S. about their objectives in the review clause, that could certainly start to undermine confidence very quickly. Right now, we're in more of a state of uncertainty, waiting to see.
With your background and presence in our trade negotiating team, do you think we have enough resources, people with expertise to handle this?
Oh, I'm sure we do. There are lots of people that have been involved in these issues for a long period of time, as I was, and I'm sure they'll do well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for your statements. Mr. Vaillancourt, we agree on one thing: the emergency climate climate emergency is real. So that I suspected of you of holding that point of view too. So we were very happy, and by we I mean we were being told a lot about the climate on the environment, and there's progress. I'd rather have that than not have anything. But I thought, like on the environmental question, you seem to be saying that there was a lot of principles, but it wasn't really worth much more than the paper it was written on. So is that true? And what could we do better? Well, it's absolutely true. When we look at the last conferences on the climate and on biodiversity that take place here in Winnipeg, in Montreal rather, we see the progress that's been made. The catastrophes are increasing, danger is increasing. So we really, the free trade agreements have to adapt to that, because parties have contributed to that climate urgency as well. So we know, the free trade agreements, in my view, and this one in particular, has to help fight climate change. And that requires a very different view of the economy, and it's quite so. For example, and the IPCC has been telling us this has told us on many occasions, we have to leave hydrocarbons underground, and we have the obligation to name things that are problems. So methane, hydrocarbons, and I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. So the Kunming and the Paris Agreement, those have to be mentioned. Other international agreements, that have been signed by 3 parties have been mentioned. So why not include those objectives in CUSMA? That would allow us to make good progress on the environmental front. I think, even if we have a new chapter on the environment, it's a very weak chapter, and it's one of the weak parts of the CUSMA agreement. All right, so if we included those international conventions, would that give any legal force to those agreements? So in other words, if the free trade agreement were to go against those environmental objectives, it could be subject to litigation. Yes, and I think what we even have to do, we would have to prioritize the environment. Environment is the most important thing in the world. We need a healthy planet, and that's more important than everything. And I don't think it's necessarily an obstacle to trade. If we live in a healthy environment, we can do trade, but if we have to prioritize both, or if we had to decide between both, the environment and the survival of the planet, that has to be the priority. That has to be an absolute priority, and it has to be included in free trade agreements, this absolute necessity to protect the environment. So I think for us, it's really key. And it's not camouflage protectionist either. It's not camouflage protectionist. It's a true need. All right, you clearly said that, even if we so NAFTA contributed to a whole generation of agreements that followed it, but it's still the official position of Canada. If you go onto the Global Affairs website, we know what the American position is. They favor withdrawal. Well, we'll see what happens with the next one, but there's nothing indicating that they want to bring that back. But you have said that you're not in favor of this. Should we not include more formal mechanisms? Should we not offer remedies to the ones the parties that could be victims of certain agreements and certain parties and certain provisions? Should we formalize legal recourse for victims? Yes, that could be interesting. One thing that Canada should develop is a better protection of whistleblowers. Whistleblowers in some places are well protected, and these people do a very important job. They reveal wrongdoing, things that are harmful for the overall population, and often those people are penalized or they find themselves in very difficult situations. So that's one of the first things that we should make sure in a more substantial manner than what we have right now. And then people might be less afraid of using legal tools and using their freedom of expression to do battles for the economy, for example, and working conditions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings, for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses here today. We've got a wonderful crowd. And I'm going to start with the CLC, Ms. Vipond. You talked about the worker-centered approach naturally and the rapid response mechanism. And you also mentioned a tripartite formula, bringing together government, unions, and business. Just wondering if you could talk about that and where that would fit in with this and whether it's been tried elsewhere, et cetera, how it could improve the process.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yes, obviously a worker-centered approach is what we want to see, and we can see in the U.S. where it is being successful in terms of framing the agreement to deliver the best, not just for corporations, but for people and communities. Our tripartite approach that we want to see happening is within the review and how we get there in terms of looking at it. And there is lots of examples of how a tripartite approach is the best approach. We obviously have on the international where we work with it on the ILO. We soon will see it hopefully, when we're looking at a sustainable job future, that we are looking at a tripartite. These are the interested parties, and getting them at the same table so we can talk about solutions and talk about what that looks like means that nobody's going to get left behind.
And, well, thanks. And how has the labor chapter been working so far? Has that rapid response mechanism been working as we heard a bit from Unifor at our last meeting that there were some issues in Mexico and the United States where perhaps we should be?
Yeah, we do need to strengthen the rapid response mechanism. It's important that it's enforcing it across the chapter, across for all countries, because the reality is that the intention of an agreement like this is to have equal access to markets. But we really recognize that it cannot result in a unequal access to workers' rights. And so that mechanism needs to have, like the rapid response needs to continue to have that kind of quick response and what it's going to look at, because any of these rules without enforcement are not going to be strong enough. So yeah, we would encourage that stays there, it stays strong, and that we, ensure that it is actually meeting the needs so that people are able to have access to labor rights that are under this agreement in all countries, that we are looking at the forced labor items that are coming in potentially to countries, and that it's actually have a meaningful response to that.
Okay. Chair, how long do I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, oh boy. Well, then I'll turn to Mr. Vishul. And you talked about, the trying to make this bringing advantages to the North American market as a whole. Just wondering about how you might also consider, say, the EU, what they're doing, where they're going with trade agreements. Is there any move to try to align new trade agreements with other major sectors like that? And one thing that I'm thinking of, I was meeting with steelworkers this morning, and they brought up the issue of the CBAM, the border adjustment mechanism. We hear a lot about, carbon leakage and things like that because Canada has a price on carbon, the United States does not. Is there any possibility that something like a North American CBAM would fly in a renewed CUSMA that would help in many ways?
Well, I think with respect to the CBAM, there's been a challenge so far in that the U.S. has shown no interest in going down that track. And as a result, we don't have too much potential to go down that track if the U.S. is not headed there. I think the biggest problem we have on the climate change side now is that we have countries going off in different directions on their own. There's no coherent approach to addressing climate change. The U.S. has an approach. The EU has a different approach. Canada has a slightly different approach. And what we need is countries to be able to take common policies and have international rules, not just domestic rules, that would allow us to have a more coherent response to climate change.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where I was headed, in that if the United States sees what's going on in the EU and they're impacted, might there be some appetite for centering all these things in the major trading partners around the world?
I would certainly hope so. The U.S. and the EU have been talking for years under the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, trying to come up with an approach that would allow them to follow the same path. The U.S. had a proposal, the EU had its proposal for CBAM primarily, but they have been unable to close the gap between them. They just are not headed in the same direction, and so that process has essentially failed. I think the U.S. and the EU will again try to come back to some kind of common ground, and Canada would certainly want to be a part of that too. But at the moment, it seems like it's pretty much stalled.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. On to Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Virrell, with the new president in Mexico, should we expect more or less collaboration?
Well, I think it's a little bit early to say for sure, given that Claudia Sheinbaum has only been in place for a couple of days, and that doesn't actually come into power until October. But I think there are some helpful signs. Our fear was that she might follow the path of former President López Obrador, which created a fair amount of tension, particularly between the U.S. and Mexico, but also with us to some extent. But in particular, we are hearing that the new Mexican president would be more sympathetic to environmental considerations and trying to move in that direction. So there may be more common ground that could be explored.
My fear, of course, is that that there might be more risk that Mexico and the United States negotiate among themselves, like they did without Canada in the steel, for steel and for aluminum. So I wanted to get your opinion on that. With regard to the conflicts between, on softwood, for example, conflicts between the US and Canada, there seems to be a lack of efficiency or effectiveness on the part of the government to make progress. There's still no agreement. There are delays as well in creating special mechanisms. The minister has not yet named a Canadian ombudsman. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that and the consequences that may come out of those irritants.
Yes, well, certainly with respect to Mexico, I think we will see significant tensions that will still exist even under the new president. There are tensions over energy and the interventionist approach that Mexico has taken to energy. There are also concerns about Chinese both imports and investment from China as operating as a backdoor through Mexico into the U.S. The U.S. is highly concerned about that. And there are security issues that are also a concern as well. So I think that it is more likely that Mexico will have more challenges in this process than either Canada or the U.S. will have. And then on softwood lumber, always a challenging issue because it's always been outside of the trade agreement with respect to trying to negotiate some kind of bilateral settlement. As you probably know, there has been work going on to try to see if that might be possible, but the appetite on the U.S. lumber industry side has not been all that high, and unless they can get interested in actually negotiating a deal, it's hard to negotiate by yourself.
Si en tout cas, vous prévoyez qu'il y aurait
Now,
peut-être
if you think that there might be some difficulties in future discussions, earlier you talked about a more coordinated approach among the three countries, and I thought that was interesting to counter China. So I'd like to have what do you mean exactly by a more coordinated approach among the three countries?
I think that when the U.S. took the action it took 3 weeks ago to impose significant new tariffs against imports from China in key areas like electric vehicles and batteries and critical minerals, that really makes life difficult for Canada and Mexico, because if the U.S. is having those actions in place, neither Canada or Mexico particularly want to become a backdoor for China to get through, because the U.S. will then look at restrictions against Canada or against Mexico. So a lot of pressure on Canada in particular to try to replicate those kinds of restrictions against imports from China. But I think all of this could be done so much more effectively if the U.S. and Canada and Mexico sat down and said, what are we going to try to do to protect the North American market from imports from China and investments from China that are not on a fair trading basis and need to be restricted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martel. Your time is up. Mr. Siju, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to our witnesses for taking the time to join us here today. My first question I'm going to start with is Mr. Laskowski. You had mentioned the repositioning of foreign empty containers. If you can expand on that a little bit. To my understanding I got from you is in the U.S. you're allowed to move full and empty containers if you're a carrier, but in Canada, if it's a U.S. plate on the trailer, you can't. Is it? So just, yeah.
Thank you for the question. So it's a critical issue. We've been talking a lot about Americans' approach to this. It's a critical issue for American business. It's more so for them than it is for the trucking industry. So the issue is this. I drive down into the United States within any state, pick a city, and I drop a load. I drop my trailer off. You have to, in the supply chain now, because of warehousing and the growth of the economy, there simply isn't enough warehousing. So what a lot of shippers and receivers do, they use the trucking industry's trailers to store goods in their area. So what happens is that the most efficient way to do this is a Canadian trucking company goes down into the United States, drops its trailer and picks up a full trailer and of your own trailer. It has to be your own trailer, another Canadian trailer that you own that's being stored there. So what is allowed is indeed that Canadian trucking company to move an empty trailer, but it must be the empty trailer that is being unloaded that day. You cannot move the empty trailer that you left there last week. So, you know, it's a difficult thing to say. So yes, you can move an empty trailer. It just has to be the one you came down with, but it totally, the supply chain doesn't function that way.
Right.
And so the same applies to an American carrier coming up to, say, Toronto once, or Windsor, whatever the case may be. They can move. So our government and our industries on both sides of the border says, okay, this arcane rule has to change. It is not good for CUSMA. It is not good for trade. Right. You know, it's 30 plus states that their biggest exporter is Canada, and it's moved by truck primarily. Yeah. And so this movement is to help them. So that is the issue. The issue is that we aren't asking for something that they're not allowing us to do. We're just asking them, let us move another empty trailer than the one we went down to that we own.
Understood. Okay, and so, as you know, our government launched the Team Canada-U.S. engagement strategy led by Minister Ng, Minister Champagne, and of course, Ambassador Hillman. In terms of this discussion, this advocacy for this very issue, are you already in touch with U.S. counterparts? And if you can maybe speak to that.
Unfortunately, for over a decade, Canada, government of Canada, has been great champions of this issue. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, have signaled to the United States that we are ready when you are. So that is why we are saying that under this review, there's ongoing work going right now by Minister Anand under the Regulatory Cooperation Council on this very issue. But if that is not successful during that process, what we are saying is, can this get attention at the table in 2025 by both governments and under the review of 2026?
So I've got about a minute left. I'm going to turn to Mr. Verhaal. With your extensive public sector experience, I'd like to know more in terms of what you think what the best impacts of our advocacy may be part of our Team Canada U.S. engagement strategy before the election and after election in November. What do you think is the best approach?
Well, I think the whole advocacy effort is really geared towards getting as many key players in the U.S. as possible, understanding the importance of not causing disruption in the Canada-U.S. relationship when it comes to trade, talking about the benefits that exist, talking about what else we could do. And I think that the advocacy effort is really what needs to happen in the lead up to the review. But we should also be making sure that we're preparing for the worst, and also making sure that we're consulting with industry, consulting with the labor sector, consulting with civil society to make sure that we've got all of our plans laid out, all of our fallbacks in place so that we've kind of gamed this out to the whole way through. And all that preparation is lengthy and detailed, but that's exactly what it takes to do well in this kind of a review.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci. Alors, Monsieur Vaillancourt. Donc,
Mr. Vaillancourt, now you were saying earlier, and you said this quite quickly because I understand that you didn't have a lot of time here, but you were saying that the ISDS is still, from the Alternative Policy Center, we received 25 recommendations, and one of those recommendations was to withdraw access to the ISDS mechanism for Canadian investors who are in Mexican, but also for Mexican investors who are in Canada. Or do you share that recommendation? Yes, absolutely, 100%. Will that be a huge? We know that this type of procedure or this litigation happened in the United States often. Well, Canada was sued a record number of times under NAFTA, so it's a bit strange that the pressure to remove it is coming from the United States. the risk is it risks having a lot of negative impact on our policies. So I think we have to renew that mechanism. Since CUSMA was established, there has been no negative impacts. There's been positive impacts in the sense that Canada, Canada is dealing with old litigation, but we can live without that mechanism. But also, all right, chapter 28 on the good regulatory practices. It looks very nice when we look at it in principle, but you're saying that it's a regulation rather than saying, listen, there will be consequences if you take action. What it says is that don't even think of it. Well, the ISDS is done. Will have a chilling effect, and it's this has been called out on a number of occasions. But it allows us to act before the law is passed and to create a significant number of obstacles so that the law can either be changed or abandoned. So that chapter is very worrisome to us. It's like it's as if it's a loss because there is still the possibility. We give parties that are non-state parties, we give them the possibility to intervene in a significant way on laws adopted by government. So in our view, this is something that worries us quite a bit.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. On to Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to turn to Mr. Verhul again and pick up in a bit on what was just being talked about, and that are these dispute mechanisms. We have the investor-state dispute mechanism between Canada and the U.S. is not in CUSMA as it now stands. But I think it's a very good thing that we have a state-to-state dispute mechanism still there. It's very important, especially when it comes to softwood lumber and other disputes. I'm just wondering if you could comment in general about where you see those chapters going in a renewed CUSMA. Would there be any pressure from especially the United States to reintroduce ISDS or get rid of the state-to-state dispute mechanisms? Just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes, well, it's certainly on the investor-state dispute settlement, we don't expect that the U.S. would have any interest in bringing that back, at least between Canada and the U.S. I think both administrations, the Trump administration prior and the current Biden administration, have no interest in going back down that track. And we don't either, or Canada doesn't either with respect to ISDS. There are the main two other dispute settlement mechanisms. One is the state-to-state dispute settlement. That we did a number of improvements so that would operate more effectively. It is operating more effectively and reaches conclusions. We're now concerned about what the U.S. may do if they hit conclusions they don't like. But that process is working well. And then the third process is dispute settlement when you have trade remedies, either countervailing duties or subsidies. And this is where the softwood lumber issues come into play, because that dispute settlement process for those issues is not functioning well. And that's hindering Canada from being able to move forward effectively on the softwood lumber issues.
And that third mechanism, is that linked at all with the WTO's problems with, the Americans refusing to fill positions? And
It's not that issue, but there are similar issues. The U.S. has put forward panelists on a number of occasions that were clearly inappropriate and conflicted to be on that kind of panel, and they just kept submitting conflicted panelists, and Canada had to reject those panelists, and it's had the effect of slowing the process down and not allowing the dispute settlement panels to come to conclusions quickly.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baldinelli for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us this afternoon. I'm going to begin with Mr. Meltzer and Mr. Verheuvel, if I could. Both of you talked about the U.S. most likely to use the review to push current disputes and, try to obtain favorable outcomes instead of pushing for areas to improve the agreement, the notion of a coordinated approach that you both mentioned. Mr. Meltzer, you interviewed the U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai at a Brookings event about CUSMA in March. And the U.S. Trade Rep had some rather frank comments in her response in the interview. And she mentioned, I think that the disputes and the dispute outcomes need to be part of this to the extent that we're not able to resolve the disputes using dispute settlement systems itself only. So this and other comments from the U.S. Trade Representative suggests for the U.S., dispute settlement is never really the final say. So to Mr. Verheuvel, your point earlier, what do we do when, essentially the U.S. gets a response that it simply doesn't like?
Well, that does undermine the whole process entirely. And as I said in my opening comments, it undermines confidence in the dispute settlement process overall, and even in the agreement, I would argue as well. So the difficulty is that if the U.S. isn't going to abide by dispute settlement decisions, then there's not much incentive for Canada or Mexico to do that either. And then you start to move towards an environment where you no longer have trade rules in the agreement, and then you don't have much of an agreement.
Mr. Meltzer?
Yeah, I think one of the goals potentially for the joint review, in order to sort of focus on a coordinated, forward-looking agenda, is not necessarily saying to the US that these bilateral irritants shouldn't be resolved politically, but it is to try to push them into channels other than the joint review so that they don't crowd out the joint review and risk overwhelming the joint review, leading to potential risk that there is no successful agreement in 2026. I think you're absolutely right that there's going to be domestic stakeholders that are going to push either administration to raise, whether it's rules of origin or market access around Canada dairy issues. The question is, can we try to make some progress on those issues outside of the joint review?
Thank you. Ms. Vipon, Mr. Meltzer, Mr. Verheuvel, you all spoke of the need for this coordinated approach to take trade issues with regards to Canada and the United States. Mr. Verheuvel, you talked about, you state a North American approach. Ms. Vipon, you talk about Canada needs a strategic approach aligned with the U.S. worker-centered approach. Mr. Meltzer, you talk about the U.S. is looking to de-risk trade with China, and to do so, closer cooperation with Canada and Mexico is needed. Last week, we had Brian Kingston of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. He mentioned about the sector looking for certainty, and the U.S. decision recently to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, as well as tariffs on batteries. I'd like to get your comments on that, because Mr. Verheuvel, you had talked about it would be better probably to get a coordinated approach in a trade agreement rather than trying to do these on a one-offs. So how does Canada respond to that?
I think the fact that the U.S. just announced that on their own through their Section 301 process, and I don't know for sure, but I don't expect there were many consultations with Mexico or with Canada beforehand, leaves Canada and Mexico in a difficult position. Does Canada and Mexico have to follow the U.S. approach and have the same kinds of tariffs in order to protect the North American market? Or if they go in a different approach, they're vulnerable to being charged by the U.S. with allowing Chinese imports coming in through the back door. So there will be pressure on us to do something, but that does not make it easy. It could be so much easier if we coordinated those efforts.
And the difficulty that we find here right now is, I mean, the government has taken an industrial approach to create a supply chain system, $40 billion of investments, but through its regulatory system, it's almost encouraging, because of the 2035 EV mandate, the continued importation of of Chinese electric vehicles. And so, to your point, when the Americans are just going to say, well, Canada, you're becoming a backdoor. All the Teslas that are coming into Canada right now are coming from China, not from the state of California any longer. And how do we encourage a supply chain in critical minerals when this 2035 mandate, we won't have mines in the ground by then? So we're going to be using Chinese minerals still as well for our own supply chain.
Can we have a brief answer, please?
Well, it's a complicated question, so brevity is a challenge, but I would just say that the way that the U.S. has proceeded with some of its policies, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, means that it's very hard for Canada to get investment in critical minerals in Canada, for example, because the U.S. is attracting all of that. It's another illustration of how we should be trying to protect the North American market on a tripartite approach, not a U.S. go-it-alone approach.
Thank you. Ms. Fortier for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions are for the Canadian Trucking Alliance and CLC. And so I'll give you two. I'll ask my question, and I'll give you 2 minutes each to answer. So could you share with the committee the relationship that you have with your counterparts in the United States, that your organizations have, and what are the policy or the regulation issues that you have in common, and what are the ones that you disagree with in the context that we're discussing right now? So I'll start with Mr. Laskowski and then Ms. Vipond.
So I'll be brief. We are very aligned with the American Trucking Association, and we work constantly with them on cross-border issues, with the issues that I brought up today, processing issues at the border. So one of the benefits that we have as an industry with regards to going into this process, we are aligned.
So in that context, what would be what you propose we should be reviewing or adding, if you have more than what you said in your opening remarks?
You know, on that note, maybe I'll turn to Lack. He's been up on the screen because he works with the American Trucking Association. Perhaps, Lack, you could discuss some of the processing questions at the border that we're working with the American Trucking Association on.
Thanks, Steve. So as Steve did mention earlier on, we're going to be looking at potentially the feasibility of the impacts of nuclear verdicts that have been occurring in the U.S. and whether or not we can align to that issue in both in the Canadian context and the U.S. trucking context. International cargo fraud has been in the increase in Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Criminal networks appear to be getting increasingly global and highly sophisticated. It's reaching a level that presents an emerging trade barrier and impacting the free flow of goods between the CUSMA member states. So that's another issue we're going to continue to look at. And Steve mentioned in his opening remarks the burgeoning trade relationship with Mexico. There's going to be more Mexican trucking companies that are doing business within Canada, and vice versa. We have many members that are looking into the Mexican market as well.
Merci. Same
Thank
question.
you.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
of the AFL-CIO, and we have a fairly, we have a close relationship. Some of it is more formal, say through the ITUC, through projects that we work on together, and some informal, just through relationships, because we have our goals are very similar in terms of raising the bar for workers when it comes to this type of work, ensuring that we have minimum standards, we're respecting the rights of workers, and ensuring that we're calling out forced labor and lower standards. We also share affiliates that are some of our international unions that are affiliated to the CLC are also affiliated to the AFL-CIO. For brevity, what I'll highlight in terms of where the differences are is that the U.S. government has a close relationship with the AFL-CIO, and they're being, they're working quite closely together in terms of the approach to what this means in terms of CUSMA, and that is one of our requests, is that we have a better relationship so that we are at the table in a more formal way here, so that we can ensure that that discussion around workers' rights and what workers need and what's good for communities includes unions.
And what about policies or regulatory opportunities that you would agree with your counterparts or disagree in this context of reviewing CUSMA?
You mean like policies that we agree that, this is about good jobs, that we need to be raising the floor and that people have family sustaining unionized jobs. So that means that the mechanisms in the CUSMA agreement have to address so that it's not a race to the bottom. And we feel very strongly of that, especially for international companies or, when we're talking about EVs and what that looks like on a global scale. And also on, different projects that are coming to North America. We work really closely. FIFA is a good example because we want to ensure good jobs and we are on the same plate as that. Yes, there's diverging interests because we want to make sure, we're here for Canadian workers. They're, obviously protecting American workers, and that doesn't need to be, head to head. That can be done well if we are having the discussions and ensure that people are protected.
Merci, thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses. Who knows, we may have to have you all come back for another session. It seems like there's lots of questions. So thank you very, very much. Meeting adjourned.